bring back the discussion here in studio. We're joined by political analyst Prince Mashele, who will be discussing and giving us his perspective and, just his experience of, Zimbabwe and the former President Robert Mugabe. Thank you so much for joining us. I think maybe let's begin by speaking about the legacy. I mean, since the news broke this morning, there's been people speaking about, what they believe Robert Mugabe has left behind and the legacy and what he stood for. And everyone has, their own view of, the man that was Robert Mugabe. But what would you say are some of the things that cannot even be argued when you think of Robert Mugabe as the leader of Zimbabwe?
Well, in the first place, this man was an embodiment of contradiction. On the one hand, he fought for the liberation of his people. It is true. So all of the things that Pule was saying are correct. But the story doesn't end there. It proceeds. And in fact, it proceeds to recent times. I was in Zimbabwe a month ago. So all of the things that Pule is talking about, it's propaganda. If you go to Zimbabwe today, you want to cry when you see how black people in Zimbabwe are living. Number one, water as we speak in Zimbabwe is not reticulated. So you drink it at your own risk. Number two, Zimbabweans get electricity from midnight to 5 o'clock in the morning. The whole day they have no electricity. Number three, Mugabe himself died in Singapore. There's no single hospital that could heal him, that could treat him in Zimbabwe. The education system has collapsed. In South Africa, it is estimated that we have more than 7 million Zimbabweans. Zimbabweans are scattered all over the world as we speak. Who caused all this mayhem, this suffering? They talk about land reform. Zimbabwe's land reform is a mess. As you and I speak now, Zimbabwe imports maize, which is the staple food of the people of Zimbabwe. The country cannot produce food for itself. That is the true legacy of Robert Mugabe, a tyrant who began as a liberation fighter.
And I mean, you speak about the issue of the hospitals, and one of the criticism that has been made over the years is how, the heads of state and the leaders in Zimbabwe can afford to go and look for healthcare treatment across their borders. But the citizens who really need the assistance cannot even go to their local healthcare facilities and get adequate healthcare services. So let's speak about the irony in Robert Mugabe dying in Singapore. And I mean, this is a man who once said he wants to die in Zimbabwe.
Here's the thing. As you and I speak now in Zimbabwe, unemployment is more than 90%. So it means that more than 90% of able-bodied men and women in Zimbabwe cannot find work. So if they were to fall sick, how would they pay for health services? They wouldn't be able to do so because they don't have money. But there are also not hospitals there. So the people who work in Zimbabwe as we speak are politicians. These are the parasites who are milking whatever remains in what you can call an economy in Zimbabwe, which has, by all indications, collapsed. So the tragedy of African politics is the tragedy of political elites who are in office for their own stomachs, not for their own people. If we look at the Zimbabwean situation now, it's very sad. People are suffering. And these are not whites, by the way. These are black people who look like you and I.
Prince, is it not possible to have a balanced view? Does the negative legacy overwhelm what was a positive legacy? What are your reflections of the positive legacy?
Well, the
not inviting you to get involved in what you've described as propaganda.
Yeah, the positive legacy is this, is that Robert Mugabe fought in the liberation struggle. That liberation struggle made it possible for black people in Zimbabwe to view themselves as being capable of managing their own affairs. That is hugely positive in the sense that before then you had the regime of Iron Smith, a white racist regime that treated black people as if they were subhuman. So we have to acknowledge the positive contribution. But you also need to look at the total outcome. So when the man is dead, let's look at what he has left behind. Remember, Amilcar Cabral said, people did not participate in the struggle because of the ideas in leaders' heads. They wanted to live normal lives. They wanted to make progress. They wanted their children to go to school.
What is your sense of what about the political system post-independence in Zimbabwe made it possible for Mugabe to completely dominate politics in the way that he did? Because everything was sort of structured and centered around Robert Mugabe. Opposition parties were being formed around the idea of Mugabe must go. Whoever was joining and sort of getting into ZANU-PF was also getting in support of Mugabe. The economy, everything seemed to center around Robert Mugabe. What is it about the post-independence Zimbabwe that made it possible for that to happen?
It's actually a very important question you are raising because it differentiates South Africa from Zimbabwe. And let me explain. ZANU-PF essentially has been a military organization. It has not been a political organization. Most people mistake ZANU-PF for a political party. It's a military organization. How has it worked? It has worked like this. The military wing, the president of the party, would be the commander of the military wing. That is when ZANU-PF was a liberation struggle fighter, right? Post-1990, when it became a government, that arrangement did not change. So the person who commanded the politics of the party was the same commander who commanded the military part of the party. So that gave power to the individual who sat at the helm, and that happened to be Robert Mugabe. So you knew that if you want to go into politics, if you go into the opposition space, you were actually faced with a military commander at the helm who commanded all the security forces in the political party, but also in the state. And he used that, by the way, to intimidate political opponents.
So that's an interesting thing that he raises there about the role of the military, Lindi, in ZANU-PF leadership, but also in post-independence, Prince, because part of what you are talking about is, for instance, how Robert Mugabe came to be the leader of ZANU. This is something that happened while they were in prison. It's not like he was elected at a Congress, that there was a Congress that said, this is our guy who becomes the leader. The leadership of ZANU had been in prison, and Dabaninga Sithole was their leader. And in that situation, it ends up with almost a vote of no confidence in prison, and Robert Mugabe becomes leader in prison. And one of the first tasks when he comes out is basically to ensure that he consolidates his control, including control of the military effort that was raging at the time, just after 1975.
Precisely. Robert Mugabe has never been a Democrat. The history that we have just narrated now shows you that this man has always been a military man, which is why, if you look at his leadership style, very early, by the way, in the 1980s, what did he do? When there was a rising opposition, particularly from the Ndebele in Zimbabwe, he wiped them out. He carried out a massacre of the Ndebele people in the 1980s, the Kukuruhunzi mayhem there in Zimbabwe. So you are quite right. This man was a military dictator. There are a few things that he did well, including, for example, reforms in education in the early 80s, which gave a few Zimbabweans good education who are scattered all over the world. Some of them are working here in South Africa. But this man, if you look at the totality of the situation, he has destroyed Zimbabwe.
Yeah, and I mean, you speak about him as a man of contradictions, and history tells us, I mean, that in, I think it was 1980, where there was a 5-year plan, and, you know, he was able to bring some type of growth to a number of industries, mining, agriculture. He built schools, his government built schools and clinics for his people. So I guess the question then is, where did it all go wrong?
Here is the thing, and it's even the story of South Africa. Liberation movements on the continent don't know how to run an economy. So if you look at the sectors you are talking about, he failed to industrialize Zimbabwe. So he never facilitated a process where factories to manufacture finished goods were produced. That was the biggest failure. So mining, primary resources, right? Agriculture is land related. If you look at Southeast Asian countries, where, by the way, he died, those countries were like Zimbabwe in the 1960s, but they were able to turn themselves around from dependence on agriculture to become manufacturing countries. He failed to do so, which is why even the so-called educated Zimbabweans, by the way, they couldn't find jobs in proper modern factories that are producing stuff.
But Prince, you will face people who will say to you that actually there was a degree of industrialization and a manufacturing base. People will talk about the textile sector. Certainly in the south of the country, in areas such as Bulawayo, there was a thriving textiles sector at a particular point. People will point you to processed products from agriculture that were being, brought onto the manufacturing cycle. You had industries that were manufacturing agriculture-related products.
I was in Zim a month or so ago. There's a huge factory on your way to Bulawayo, just before Kwekwe, which was actually a thriving textile firm, massive. Number one, it was never established by Mugabe. It was established by white people in Zimbabwe. As we speak now, its doors are closed. Why are the doors of the factories closed? It's precisely because of what Mugabe's regime did. Extracting rent from business and really driving business down. So even if you talk about agriculture, by the way, Mugabe inherited an economy that was doing fairly okay. And if you look at who was actually running those factories, it was not black people, it was white people. When he took over the economy, the elites of ZANU-PF went to parcel out land and all sorts of goodies and then ran down the economy. That is the real story of Zimbabwe. It's not the propaganda that people spread. If you go there, the factories are closed. Who closed them down? Precisely because of the policies of Robert Mugabe.
How much personal responsibility, as the last one from me, Prince, how much responsibility should he take as Robert Mugabe, and how much is collective? You remember that whole situation about this guy who said about our situation, that his concern was not about the prince of fools, it's about the confederate of fools that are willing to make such a fool their prince in the first place. He wasn't alone. What made this personality cult around Robert Mugabe such that people that are sensible at various points, I mean, he had people who were technocrats even, that knew what should be happening, but it seemed they just could never stamp their authority decisively within ZANU-PF to effect a change that says this path we are on is destructive.
Here is the thing. When you run a patronage system, such as Mugabe ran in Zimbabwe, every person who matters, who wears a suit and a tie, ultimately is paid via the party, via the state. So you know that if you speak out, you are going to be dealt with, you are going to go hungry, or even be killed, by the way, in the context of Zimbabwe. People were killed. So it was made possible by the repressive system because everything was tied to the state. So there was no economy proper where people would go have normal jobs, because if you are not tied to the state system, you wouldn't have a job as an elite, as a black elite. So everything else was tied to the state. That was the problem. That is why even here in South Africa, by the way, look at the ANC. The elites, the black elites, in the main, are tied to the patronage system of the state, the people who matter in South Africa. So once you have a system like that, the president becomes a commander of everything, because if you know if you speak out, you're going to be dealt with. So that is precisely what went wrong in Zim. The lack of diversification of the economic system to create space for people to live normal lives and work without them being tied to the state.
All right. Well, as we're having this conversation, we're bringing you live visuals from Mozambique, where Pope Francis is visiting the country as part of his 3-nation African tour. These are, as I said, live visuals coming in, and he is speaking to the people on his first full day in the country. Now, Pope Francis applauded a recently signed peace deal between government and rebels.
Yeah, the Pontiff's visit comes after the government and the former rebel group Renamo, now the main opposition party, signed a historic treaty. You'll know, of course, about the history of conflict in Mozambique, a 15-year civil war that ended, I think it was in 1992, if my history is not failing me. But certainly, even after that happened, after that ending of that civil war, you did see intermittent clashes come up from time to time with the result that Mozambique has really struggled to get a solid and lasting, enduring peace, and there would be tensions from time to time. And in fact, reports saying that Renamo was never fully disarmed, and that was one of those issues that became a point of contention. In fact, I think around 2013, tensions were coming to a head. So the pontiff visiting Mozambique at this time, hailing that agreement between the government of Frelimo and the opposition, Renamo, and urging the people to take and actually commit to that path of peace.
All right, well, we'll continue to bring you an update on that story and keep an eye on that. But let's continue and wrap up our conversation with Prince Mashele, who's an analyst on the death of former President Robert Mugabe. Now, Prince, I mean, this man has been described as someone who overstayed his visit as the head of the country. And, I mean, the question is now, you know, with us sitting in South Africa, how are the citizens of Zimbabwe supposed to react to this death, and what's the likelihood, you know, that they will sympathize and be sad that the former president has now passed away?
If you want to practically have an idea as to how Zimbabweans in South Africa should react, imagine yourself being in Zimbabwe because your country, South Africa, was a mess. How would you react if you learned that the dictator who made it possible for you to leave your country has died? That's how you should frame the question. I would feel sad if I were outside South Africa because some dictator has destroyed my country. It is not nice to go and live in a foreign country. It is nice to live in your own country with your own family members and work there. So Zimbabweans who are in South Africa must be feeling very sad because the death of this man reminds them of the road they have traveled, the road that led them to leave their country and come and work here. So they need to reflect and say, what is it that they must do now that this man is gone to rebuild their own country? Hopefully someday they would go back and build their own country and work there.
Yeah. Well, rebuilding their own country is a lot of what we've heard come from the ANC as well. Pulemabe bringing us his reaction, saying, absolutely, you know, it's time that the residents united and fought for a government that they ideally would like to have.
And what a journey it's going to be, Lindi, because it's not an easy path at all. I mean, there was that moment where the nation had sort of some hope that with the fall of Robert Mugabe, part of the celebrations were about that in November 2017 to say, we now have an opportunity. We are not saying we have arrived in the promised land, but we actually now have an opportunity to define this country outside of the figure of Robert Mugabe, that, you know, a person who had dominated politics for a good almost 40 years, really, because it goes back even before independence.
And I mean, tell us, you went to Zimbabwe. I know Prince Mashele explained his experience and shared it with us. Share with us what it was like for you.
Yeah. So how much time do we have? You know what? I tell you what, we'll do that in just a moment. Let's just quickly take a